Welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast, all about improving the lives of animals with better policies and practices in government and business. Brought to you by Animal Wellness Action, where we believe helping animals helps us all. Here's your host, Joseph Grove.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast. I'm Joseph Grove. Today, we're discussing a disturbing issue that strikes at the heart of how our nation treats the animals who serve alongside our military personnel. These animals, known as military working dogs, play essential roles in protecting American troops. They detect explosives, they patrol bases, they assist in security operations, and they often serve in some of the most dangerous environments in the world. Their work saves human lives. But according to a new investigation and press release issued by Animal Wellness Action and the Center for a Humane Economy, there are troubling reports of lethal neglect of military working dogs on American bases. Failures in care and oversight that have led to suffering and preventable deaths among animals who were trained and deployed to serve this country. This issue raises difficult questions. Are military working dogs receiving the veterinary care and humane treatment they deserve? Are there systemic failures in how these animals are managed after deployment or when they become ill? And what reforms are necessary to ensure that these highly trained animals are treated not as expendable equipment, but as the sentient partners they are? To help us unpack these questions, we're joined today by two experts. First is Dr. Thomas Poole, a veterinarian and public health expert with decades of experience in military veterinary medicine. Dr. Poole spent 26 years in the U.S. Army, ultimately serving as commander of the U.S. Army Veterinary Command, and later served as the territorial veterinarian for Guam for 17 years. We're also joined by Kate Schultz, a lawyer with deep experience prosecuting animal cruelty cases and advancing legal protections for animals. Before joining Animal Wellness Action, she served in the Queens District Attorney's Office in New York City, where she worked in the Animal Cruelty Prosecutions Unit, and she has also worked in the Animal Law Litigation Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School. Together, they bring both legal and veterinary perspectives to an issue that raises serious concerns about accountability, animal welfare, and the obligations we owe to animals who serve in uniform. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your joining me today for this show.
Thanks, Joseph. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, Joseph.
Tom, let's start with you. Unpack this. Tell us about this press release our organization's issued about military working dogs.
There's a lot to unpack here. This was a very troubling report that came out in February. It was a Department of Defense level Inspector General's report. Now that's the highest, worst kind of IG report you can have. And it goes all the way to the Secretary of the Air Force, who is responsible for everything having to do with military working dogs. Even though all the services have military working dogs, the Secretary of the Air Force is responsible. So that's the best kind of report because, everybody up and down the chain is going to hear about this. And if you notice in the report, it is his chief of staff for logistics, deputy chief of staff for logistics, who is primarily responsible for making sure this gets done. So there are many, many levels below him. And in a sense, every one of those levels failed the Secretary of the Air Force. And you can be sure he's not happy about this. And these DOD IGs are, as I said, it's as bad as it could get. One of my bosses was a 3-star general, and he had a single finding from a DOD IG, and he was subsequently relieved of duty and forced to retire as a 2-star general. So these things, everybody's going to be paying a lot of attention to this, and that's a very good thing because it deserves attention. So this military working dog program, it's very old. And right now, it's about 1,600 animals or so stationed around the world. And they do such terrifically important work. And I could spend, another hour or so just describing to you the things these dogs can do because it's just amazing. It's unbelievable. And the program is very expensive and rightfully so. These dogs, after training, after initial training are worth about $50,000. And we've spent almost that much in getting to that point. And once the dogs become highly trained after they've been experienced for a while, if you're going to sell one of these dogs that's 3 or 4 years old and really good, then the security services will pay up to $100,000, the private security services for one of these dogs. So we have invested an awful lot of time and people and money and everything else into this thing. So for a report like this to come out that shows sort of widespread negligence in the care of these dogs, it's extremely troubling and really well beyond my experience. As you mentioned, I was the commander of U.S. Army Veterinary Command, which is a worldwide tri-service command. The Army veterinarians have really executive agents for all of the care for these dogs everywhere in the world, whether they're Navy, Marines, whatever. We're the ones that have to take care of them. And so, of course, I've seen these facilities all over the world, and they were generally very good. I wasn't seeing things like were discussed in that report.
But I want our listeners to understand, before we go any further, what the report revealed. What were these animals experiencing, and what should have been done differently to ensure that whatever they experienced shouldn't have happened?
Sure. Well, there were two big categories of things. And one of them was the physical structures where the dogs were maintained were not in good condition. And so, for example, the dogs weren't protected in some cases from extremes of temperature, high and low. You're supposed to keep those dogs between 45 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. When it's colder than 45, they need to have, heat, they need to have protection from that. Same thing when it gets above 85. And so these dogs were not experiencing that. And in one case, at one installation, 22 dogs over a 2-year period suffered heat stroke. Heat stroke is extremely dangerous in dogs, often results in death. It didn't result in the death of any of those 22 dogs, which is good. But even then, there's often post-trauma neurological problems. So having heat stroke in dogs is a critical issue. Then the other big thing was that the dogs weren't getting enough enrichment. They're supposed to get 5 hours a day of basically attention, because these are extremely high energy, sort of high maintenance dogs. We select them for that. We want dogs that really want to work hard, that really care, that are high strung and ready to go. But those dogs aren't going to sit around on a couch all day like some basset hound. They're completely different animals, and they require a minimum of 5 hours a day. And these dogs weren't getting anything like that. Some of these dogs were being walked for 10 minutes, 4 times a week. That's it. Well, that's just horrible negligence, and it can't happen to dogs like these. So those are the two big areas.
Right. Yeah. So what kind of dogs are we talking about? Clearly not basset hounds, probably not Chihuahuas. Are they German Shepherds? Which is what my mind conjures up when I think of them.
Well, that's what they used to be. In the beginning of my career, we had almost all German Shepherds, and we even got into what was called the super dog program, where we were breeding our own German Shepherds. We were taking the largest Shepherds we could find, about 120 pounds, and breeding them. And it was unsuccessful because not we, the veterinarians weren't doing it. The people that were doing it for the Department of Defense ended up breeding in a lot of hip dysplasia, and it just didn't work. And so we switched to Belgian Malinois and Dutch Shepherds, which are, a little difficult to distinguish from each other, actually, but they're smaller. Whereas the average German Shepherd was 80 or 90 pounds. These dogs are 60 pounds or so, 50, 60, 70 pounds. And they have much, much more energy. When we had German Shepherds at the end of a patrol, which was maybe 4 to 6 hours, the handler was exhausted and the dog was exhausted, and they both had to wait until the next day. These Malinois have so much energy that we could often use one handler for a patrol and let the dog come back and rest for an hour, and then use another handler for another patrol. So you almost get twice the dog for your investment. And they are also they're more agile. They can climb much higher. You can watch, videos on Instagram or YouTube and see the things these Malinois can do. It's just unbelievable. They run at balls that are like 40 feet tall. It's crazy what they can do. And they can also, they're much lighter whenever we're using them now with airborne troops, so that you're jumping out with a dog, they're rappelling the dogs down on ropes and things. So having a somewhat smaller dog is also better. So these dogs just have higher energy. They actually have better noses than our Shepherds have. German Shepherds had. So they're just sort of superior in most ways.
You can jump out of an airplane with these dogs?
Oh, they do. They do all the time. You bet they do. They put little goggles on them and
No, they don't. No, come on.
They do.
Dr.
No, they
Poole.
do. No, they do. They put little goggles on them.
Or do they call them doggles? Is that what those are?
Because when you go out, that wind speed is very high. When you're jumping out to, 130 or 40 miles an hour of wind. And so you have to have something on to protect your eyes when you first go out. But yeah, no, they do that. And they rappel the dogs down on ropes and things. And these dogs, they're ready to go. They want to do anything. They love to work. You can see how much these dogs, they know what their jobs are. They love their jobs. It's just so rewarding working with these animals.
We need photos of these doggos ASAP.
That's not the only kind of working dogs we have. Just we have a few other kinds. We use a few Labradors and for some special things. And we also have these, they're called German hunt dogs. And we've had these now for a few years. And the Navy uses these mostly for doing shipboard and submarine inspections because they're a good bit smaller. They're about 25 pounds. And they can get even into areas that the Malinois are a little too big to get to.
Fascinating. Give us a feel for the kinds of things these dogs do. I alluded to a couple of things and, clearly, I guess, smelling for contraband. What does the military use these dogs for?
Okay, when we procure the dogs, and we procure either by purchasing them mostly in Europe, although we purchase a few from American breeders also. And then we also breed our own now. We also have our own program where we're taking our best dogs and breeding them. And right now, about 15% of our working dogs are ones that we bred ourselves. And so you take them in and at about 1 year of age. And when we buy them from about 1 to 3 years of age. And then you take them in and start them in training. And the training lasts about 4 months. It's about 120 days of that training. And you're teaching these dogs an awful lot of things and testing them for temperament and all sorts of things. And at the end of it, only about 50% pass. So we spend about $5,000 or $6,000 each when we buy these dogs, sometimes more, but rarely less. And so you've already got a pretty big investment. So just in dog cost, when you graduate the dog, just in dog cost, it's going to be about $12,000 because you're getting about half of them to go through it. And that doesn't count, of course, everything else that went into the training of them, the feeding them, everything else. So there's a pretty significant investment by the time they finish it. When they finish their initial training, they're trained to do really just two things. One is patrol and one is detection of one kind of thing. Now, patrol, there's several different parts of patrol too. That is just walking on alert with a handler. It is also for, they have to be able to do attack on commands and release on command. And all of that is part of the basic patrol. And then the detection, they're trained just to detect one thing in the beginning, either drugs or explosives. And that is very sophisticated training. And it's amazing what they can do. And I've played with these dogs a lot. And we have actual drugs that we use. And I don't know how much cocaine you snorted, Joseph, but it really has no odor at all. I mean, it has no fragrance, no aroma, no nothing. You stick your nose in it and you don't smell anything. Now, I can smell marijuana. I can smell hashish, but that stuff smells like nothing. And yet those dogs can detect it from far away. It's amazing. We had somebody that was trying to smuggle hashish rocks in. And so what they did was they had these hashish rocks that they formed to look like gravel. And they put them in the bed of the truck and then covered the truck with gravel. So at the very bottom of all this gravel, there's 4 or 5 of these hashish rocks. And as that truck is driving through the gate, the dog didn't have to get up in the truck or anything. He could mark that truck up. This truck's hot. And then it's just a matter of finding it. The ability of their noses, you just can't begin to exaggerate it. As you probably know, they're using dogs now to detect cancer. Dogs can smell people. And so we just have no knowledge. I know we think they're stupid because they can't talk, and they think we're stupid because we can't smell anything, So, anyway, the abilities of these dogs just can't be exaggerated. And that's what we use them for.
The smelling abilities of dogs, it's just amazing, right? And it's surprising to hear just how miraculous that sense of theirs is, that they're able to pick that up. So when they're out on patrol, essentially they're almost like a sidearm or an armament of these soldiers, right? They're out there, and I assume they can help defend the soldier in hand-to-hand combat. Is that why they go out on the patrol too, or are there other reasons?
Right. Well, they bring a skill set that no human has. Their low light vision is so much better than ours. And of course, they can smell and hear so much better than we can. So these dogs understand the plan. They know what they're out there for. They completely get it. And so when they see anything suspicious, if they hear anything, if they smell anything, they're going to let you know. So it massively increases the detection ability of a person on patrol. That's one thing. Then the other thing is their physical abilities, their ability to chase someone down and catch them. There's not a human in the world that could begin to outrun one of these dogs. And so, and the other thing is, it's fun to see because these miscreants will sometimes challenge a military police officer, even an armed one, thinking that they can get to them before they can get the gun out, or that they're going to be afraid to use the gun or whatever like that. But when you bring the dog into this situation, everything changes. You just have to be an idiot to try to take on one of these dogs. And maybe it's a female security, patrol officer, and somebody might be willing to challenge that. I can take this chick. Well, she's got a 70-pound, unbelievably athletic, intelligent chainsaw right there that she can turn loose on you. And it's not going to stop until she tells it to stop. And so, no, you just have to be an idiot. And so they greatly expand the abilities of a person on patrol.
You said something I thought was interesting, and which may speak to some in our audience who are generally opposed to the employment of animals for human purposes. And that is that you perceive these dogs enjoy the work. Say more about that.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And really, it's all of the dogs that are used. USDA uses Jack Russell Terriers to hunt for brown tree snakes on Guam. Every aircraft, everything that leaves Guam has to be inspected by a Jack Russell Terrier to make sure that a brown tree snake didn't make it into the wheel well. It's been proven that these snakes can survive in wheel wells without pressurization or everything. And so everything's got to get checked by those Jack Russells, and they love their work. They just love their work. Whenever you go to take them out of the kennel, they're so excited, and they won't quit. They'll smell something. We had a big generator. It was a brand new generator. It was a $100,000 generator, and we had just gotten it in. And it had only been there for like 1 or 2 nights. And we didn't think it was possible a snake could have gotten in there. But a Jack Russell Terrier said, there's a snake in here. And he would not quit. And this thing is the size of a locomotive almost, not quite that big. But I mean, it's big. It's a huge generator. And he wouldn't give up on it. And they needed the generator. So we brought in another Jack Russell. He said, yep, it's in there. And they wouldn't give up on it. And so, well, anyway, long story short, we had to leave that thing there for a month, and the snake finally left on its own because they couldn't disassemble the whole thing and find these snakes can be small. But eventually the snake left, and the Jack Russell said it was clear, and then they were happy and everybody was happy. But I mean, they know what they're doing and they love it.
Fascinating. So talk about the role of veterinarians in their care. How often are these dogs seen by the veterinarians, and what sorts of issues do the docs look for? Assuming they're probably pretty standard to what a normal vet would look for, but what specialty things do they examine?
No, it's actually quite a lot more. I mean, we treat these dogs so much better than we treat the GIs. These dogs get a full physical inspection, not less than every 6 months. And it takes a couple of hours to do one of those. You are checking everything in the world. You're having to write it all down. You're doing complete blood work. You're checking for parasites, blood parasites, intestinal parasites, everything. And you're reading through the history of everything the handler has written in. And if there's any report of lameness or anything like that, you're going to do radiographs. And so it takes a long time. And then you finish it, and 5, not more than 6 months later, you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And it's extremely important. And I used to trip up that the young captains because we have so much emphasis on how important this is. And the trick question I would say is you're doing a routine military working dog physical and an on-base pet gets hit by car, which has priority. And they would always say, military working dogs have priority because we pound that into them. No, wrong answer. A routine military working dog physical does not have priority over an emergency. Okay, so get that straight. But that's how important we make this, that every captain thinks the right answer is the military working dog physical, because they are important, just not more important than that.
Yeah. So I hear everything you're saying about the importance of the dogs, the criticality of the veterinary inspections, the examinations that are routine. What happened in the case we're discussing that these dogs could have gone without the proper temperature adjustments, without the stimulation? Where was the breakdown? Would you guess, or do you know?
I don't know. And you really don't have to guess, or you shouldn't have to, because at the bottom level, you've got a kennel master who's usually an enlisted guy. He's usually an E6 or an E7, and he's the kennel master. He's responsible for that kennel. He has to write reports and that sort of thing. So he should be submitting reports saying, we need this. And that goes up to the next level. And this stuff goes ultimately all the way to the Secretary of the Air Force. Somebody along the line said, well, that's not important. We're not going to fund it. That's where the problem stops. That's the guy that is responsible for this happening. I'm talking about the facilities and maintenance. Now, it's slightly different in terms of the dogs not being given the enrichment, not given the 5 hours. That's a manpower shortage, which can also sometimes be a funding thing. But the thing that frustrates me, Joseph, is this entire military working dog program, the whole thing, the kennels, the staffing, the everything, the purchase, the procurement of the dogs, everything all together is about $15 million a year for the whole Department of Defense. And the Air Force budget for this year was $250 billion. So that's about 1/16,000th. So the whole military working dog budget, if you took the whole Air Force, divided them into 16,000 pieces, one piece of those is the entire military working dog budget. So I'm really not very sympathetic when you say we don't have the money for this. Yes, you absolutely do. Somebody's got their priorities messed up a little bit here, in my opinion. And that's what this report doesn't really identify is who the big Ike is in this thing. But you can be sure Secretary of the Air Force is going to figure that out.
I'm tempted to walk into a political minefield and speculate whether Doge was part of this, whether it was an arbitrary decision by someone who didn't know any better coming in trying to arbitrarily cut costs. But I won't do that. I won't raise that as an issue. So,
well, this is old. These things have been, broken down for a long time. So, you can't blame this one on Doge. And it sounded to me like in this report that this was a whistleblower that got this thing going. And that's a good thing that the system works that way anyway.
All right. I want to turn to Kate now, next, but before we do, Dr. Poole, let's talk about the bomb detection dogs, because they are the rarest and most highly trained among military working dogs, I think. What makes it that so difficult as a specialty to be trained?
Well, part of it is because those things can be harder to detect because they're often encased in something. And so, and then there's also, they can be booby traps. So these dogs have to be very cautious. They can be over aggressive. They've got to be, usually most of these dogs, in my experience anyway, when they detect something, they're trained to just sit down. They just sit down and look at the handler, which, they never sit down. It's the last thing they ever want to do. When that dog sits down and looks at you, okay, he's found what you're looking for. So for whatever reason, and I'm not an expert on the training on these dogs, it's just harder to get a really good bomb dog than it is a drug dog. But both of them are hard, compared to, I used to train bird dogs, but they're much, much harder than that, much more difficult than that. But these dogs have amazing abilities. But I would say that a really good bomb dog is rarer and harder to come by than a good drug dog.
I am wanting to train our dog to smell TV remote controls because we lose those all the time. And if we could train a dog to find the remote, that would be worth something to me. So if you ever hear about a program that does that, Dr. Poole, please let me know.
You're listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsor.
Animal Wellness Action depends on countless people like you to support our fight for animals. Join us today by donating to further our campaigns to spare countless animals from cruel and needless pharmaceutical tests. Put an end to animal fighting. Liberate farm animals from extreme confinement and so many others. Become a donor at any amount. Visit animalwellnessaction.org/donate to join our fight against animal cruelty of all kinds. Again, that's animalwellnessaction.org/donate. Thank you.
Now, back to the Animal Wellness Podcast.
Kate, you've spent years prosecuting crimes against animals in New York. From a legal standpoint, how should we think about cases where military working dogs suffer neglect or inadequate medical care on U.S. bases?
Thanks, Joseph. I brought up the criminal aspect not because I think that people should be criminally prosecuted in this case, and I'll go into why I don't think that they should in a little bit, but more to give us some context with which to think about what we saw out of this report. So let's say an average dog owner living in, a neighbor was committing the type of neglect that we saw in this report, lack of adequate housing and shelter. Some parts of the report mentioned that there was contaminated water, inadequate veterinary care, perhaps. Although we don't know too many of the details, but these are the sort of things that we saw. In many states, animal cruelty laws, if not every state, certainly the lack of adequate shelter and housing would be considered a criminal offense. Now, this is different because, as Dr. Poole mentioned, this is not exactly due to a specific individual. The kennel master, I'm sure, would love to have taken care of these dogs better, but when there's no resources, you can't get water out of a stone, right? So I really view this as more of an institutional failure rather than someone being or potentially being criminally liable. But I like to bring up the criminal sphere just to give us a sense of how severe the findings in this report were, that if this was happening in someone's home, they could be potentially arrested. And I also want to preface this by saying, I was raised in San Diego. I live in San Diego now again. That is a big military town. I have friends and neighbors who are service members, and I have the utmost respect for any and all of our service members. I mean, their job is unbelievably hard. And, when I say this is an institutional failure, it is not the individual service member's failure. It is a failure along that chain of command, along that line that Dr. Poole was talking about, that was not giving the service members even the adequate resources to do their job in taking care of these animals. If you have friends or family that are service members, you also know that the military sometimes does not give them the resources necessary for their own, pleasant living. There is a lot of construction and fixing that needs to happen on bases as well for, residential areas and things like that. So, of course, this is not just limited to dogs, but I think that there's absolutely, we morally and ethically have a duty to care for these dogs when we are the ones putting them in these jobs, which I believe that they do happily as well, but they don't have voices. They can't speak up. And so we need to make sure that these dogs that are such a vital part of our armed forces, and I'm sure are the absolute best friends of many of these service members, are treated properly.
Right. Thank you, Kate. And I know you're not a military attorney.
No.
You're right that that's not your background. But let me ask you, to the best of your knowledge, and perhaps Dr. Poole would know also, what legal mechanisms exist, if any, to hold individuals or institutions accountable in this scenario?
Well, Joseph, that's a great question. And what I feel comfortable answering is what mechanisms exist for outside entities to hold the military accountable. I think Dr. Poole is better suited to talk about departmental mechanisms for accountability. So in terms of, let's say, a nonprofit or an individual wanted to sue the Department of Defense to rectify the situation, that would be essentially impossible for a whole lot of reasons. And it's a lot of nitty gritty that I won't go into. But the Department of Defense in general is very difficult to sue. People can do it. There are ways to sue the Department of Defense for torts. But there's a lot of things like legal standing and some other details that would just in practice make it nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, for a nonprofit to get action taken as a result of litigation per se. In terms of, let's say that, I'm not saying that this happened here, but let's just say that there was an incident where there was a service member who was particularly responsible for certain failures or certain even, acts of commission or omission. It would depend on whether that service member is a member of the military itself or is a civilian employed by the military. If they're a civilian employed by the military, in general, they could be prosecuted in theory under federal law by a U.S. Attorney's Office. However, service members are, of course, if a crime is committed on base, they're, of course, dealt with intra-militarily. They're not able to be prosecuted by local federal attorneys. In addition to that, I would say that even if, and again, I'm not saying that it happened here, even if a federal animal cruelty offense, were to be contemplated, there actually is not really any federal law that criminalizes neglect per se. The federal animal cruelty laws criminalize things like animal fighting, making crush videos, extreme egregious abuse, sexual abuse, things like that. And that's for good reason. It's because the role of federal law enforcement authorities when it comes to animal cruelty issues is really about big situations, big cases that go through multiple states or cross state lines. There's no reason that a federal authority needs to be involved in a local, simple, I say simple in quotations, animal neglect case. That's for the local authorities. So there's really no federal law that could be applied to a case of egregious neglect. Now, there are legal mechanisms where state law might apply if there is no federal law available. That's really getting into the weeds. And long story short, that's just a very unlikely scenario to happen. Now, the last possible way that a type of legal mechanism could be implemented here is in petitioning the government for a rulemaking. And this could easily happen. Various nonprofits, individuals, whoever could petition the federal government for a regulatory fix. I don't know what types of regulatory fixes would be effective here because that is absolutely a better question for Dr. Poole. But that is a theoretical, practical legal mechanism that could happen. And that could put in place new rules and regulations that would then inform how these dogs are to be treated and what sort of safeguards might exist.
So, Dr. Poole, do you perceive the incident we're discussing was a failure of a regulatory framework or merely a lapse in execution under an existing adequate framework already?
Yes, I think probably the regulations are adequate. I think that it is, as you said, more of an execution thing. And the military has so many broad stroke ways they can come after you, dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming and all kinds of things that I don't know that you would need a new statute or something in order to be able to make this better. I think the attention that this report is going to get this is already embarrassing. The Secretary of the Air Force, his name is at the top of this report, and he's going to turn to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and say, how'd you let this happen? And he's going to turn to the guy to him, how'd you let this happen? This is going to go all the way down the chain until the guy that let it happen, and he's going to carry the water for this thing. So these things work. I'm going to be very surprised if somebody doesn't get fired, if a series of people don't get fired over this. That's how this sort of works, rather than, sending them to Fort Leavenworth, where we actually have a dog program there too, where the inmates train shelter dogs. So I don't think they'll end up there, but perhaps they should.
Well, and I was saying, when you said they were at Leavenworth, I thought it maybe was for dogs who misbehaved, but it's not. Okay, all right, good. We're not sending our dogs to the doggy jail. That's right. So Dr. Poole, I mean, there have been jokes by one of my several stepfathers growing up was in the Army, and he talked about, that if a soldier gets frostbite, he gets in trouble because he's damaging government property, right? And I think the dogs have historically been categorized as equipment. Correct me if I'm wrong. Has that legal framework, if I'm right, evolved? And how does that classification affect the protections these animals receive today?
I'm not JAG attorney to know if, the current status on that, but it's a big deal. Anytime we had a military working dog die for any reason, we had to write so many reports. There was so much that went up and down the line about that this was never a small issue. So these dogs, and I don't think that's changed. I've been retired for a while, but I don't think that's changed. They're just extremely important. And partly it is because that we've spent so much money creating them, but it's also because they're so mission essential. They do things that nobody else can do. We simply don't have anything to replace them with. And so it's either a dog or nothing in many of these situations. So I don't think anybody's going to be casual about this report. I don't really think we have to worry about that.
Kate, based on your experience in animal law and prosecution, what kinds of policy or legal reforms would most effectively prevent situations where these military working dogs are subjected to neglect or inadequate care?
I think I agree with Dr. Poole that there are the law in and of itself, in terms of the treatment that is required for the dogs, should, in theory, be adequate. And I think the failure here is in the lack of transparency and the failure of implementation, as Dr. Poole mentioned. It's tricky to point to specific reforms that could be effectuated about transparency because, famously, and for very good reason, there's a lot of lack of transparency about what happens on bases to the general U.S. public. That's often for very good reason. But I think what I could say that could theoretically be helpful is some mechanism for increased transparency to the public about this, about the military working dog program and how it is functioning. So, the fact that this report came out now, although these issues have been percolating for at least multiple years, according to the report, I think it would be useful to have something set up where more reports, or I should say regular reports, are released. This could be something like the U.S. Congress requiring some type of report to be released every X period of time. The U.S. Congress then, it could be a public report also made to the U.S. Congress, but publicly available. It could be a redacted report. It could be even a partially classified report made available to only the Committee on Congress or the committees on Congress that are responsible. I think that would be a great starting mechanism because, the real difference here is there are a lot of animal facilities all over the country, military and not, from anywhere from shelters to dog testing labs, of course, which our organizations do work to fight against, and kennels, etc. But the thing is it is these bases that are really that are holding these military working dogs that are really off limits to the public for very good reason, but then also off limits to the public eye, right? Unlike my city shelter where I can wander through and look at the dogs. And yes, there are portions that are off limits, of course, But I can see how the dogs are housed. I can see what they're doing in their kennels. The public can get a good general sense. You can't do that to the dogs on these bases. So something needs to happen where there is some sort of middle ground that can be reached. And I don't want to increase paperwork on the military. I don't want to increase stuff like that. But I think reports, and this report is a good accountability mechanism. And, Congress could require that this is issued maybe once a year until the problem is resolved. I don't know if Dr. Poole agrees with me or not, though, and I would defer to him.
No, I do agree. I think that makes good sense. These reports are already being written. We do routine facilities inspections on things and they go up the line. So it's not that we need more paperwork. We need more people that are responding to the paperwork. We need to hold them accountable. And I think this IG report is going to do that. It's just, it shouldn't have to go this far before something is done.
All right, very good. Dr. Tom Poole is actually the senior veterinarian for Animal Wellness Action and the Center for Humane Economy. And Kate Schultz is our senior attorney. So certainly grateful to you both. I'd like to have a show at some point, Dr. Poole, that talks about other military uses for animals. And we could talk about that, but I know that sometimes they're used to simulate battlefield injuries and things like that. There's a whole other show there I think would be fascinating to have at some time. But for now, talking about military working dogs, I'm very grateful for their time today to tell us about the incident, what likely caused it, the variety of uses these dogs perform to help our military and to help our country. So thank you both.
Thank you for listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And follow Animal Wellness Action on Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. To stay current with all of our news and information and to take action to help animals, sign up at animalwellnessaction.org. Until next time, remember, helping animals helps us all.